The collective shadow. Jung's naming of the shadow wasn't his major achievement, neither was his theory of archetypes. His major achievement was to show that human beings share a self. Who am I depends on who are we. Human beings are the only creatures who can create a self. In fact, we must create one because the self gives us a point of view, a unique focus on the world. Without a self, our brains would be bombarded with a bewildering flood of sensory images that would not make sense. Infants lack a self and spend the first 3 years creating it, fashioning their personalities and preferences, temperaments and interests. Every mother can testify that the time her baby spends as a blank slate is minimal, if it exists at all. We enter the world not as passive receivers of sense data, but as eager creators. Once you become a single self with needs, beliefs, impulses, drives, wishes, dreams, and fears, suddenly the world makes sense. I, me, and mine exist for one purpose: to give you a personal stake in the world. We all have a self, and we go to great lengths to defend its right to exist. But our creation is fragile. We have all experienced personal crises, such as the sudden death of a loved one, or the discovery that we are seriously ill. Any crisis that attacks our sense of well-being also attacks our sense of self. If you lose your house, or all your money, or your spouse, this external event sends tremors of fear and doubt throughout the self. At any moment when you feel that your world is falling apart, what is really falling apart is the self and its confidence that it understands reality. After any major trauma to body or mind, it takes time for the fragile ego personality to recover. We're very lucky that an old adage is true: souls don't break, they bounce. Because we don't know how we created the self that we cling to so desperately, the self can surprise and amaze us. Freud sprang a major surprise when he said that the self has a hidden dimension filled with drives and desires that we hardly recognize. After becoming Freud's most prominent disciple, Jung realized that his mentor had made a mistake. The unconscious isn't about me. It's about us. When a person has unconscious impulses and drives, they come from the entire history of humankind. Each of us, according to Jung, is linked to a collective unconscious, as he called it. The notion that you and I created our separate, isolated selves is an illusion. We tapped into the vast reservoir of all human aspirations, drives, and myths. This shared unconscious is also where the shadow lives. Some people are social, others asocial, but no one can stand outside the collective self. We is a constant reminder that no man is an island. Jung peeled away the social surface to expose the hidden dimension of we. Calling this realm the collective unconscious made it sound more technical, perhaps, but the self you and I share with everyone else is basic to our survival. Think of the ways you fall back on the collective self. Here are just a few. When you need the support of your family and closest friends, when you join a political party, when you volunteer for a charity or a community, when you choose to fight for your country or otherwise defend it, when you identify with your nationality, when you think in terms of us versus them, when a disaster somewhere else affects you personally, when you are gripped by collective fear. It's a fantasy to believe that you can opt out of we, even though all of us try to. We want to be seen as Americans, but not the ugly American. We sympathize with other ethnic groups, but also feel different, separate, and usually better. In a crisis, we want our families as close as possible, yet on other occasions, we insist on being individuals with a life outside the family. The coalition between I and we is an uneasy one. Jung made it even more uneasy. When it comes to the collective shadow, people struggle to opt out. Society will never stop moving in ways we disapprove of. But this is actually harder than opting out of a family role. Indeed, the family is only the first unit or level of the collective self, the one we tend to see fairly easily. At Thanksgiving, you can announce that you've changed, that you don't deserve to be treated like a spoiled 5-year-old or a rebellious teenager. You may not feel that you are being heard. Your family may have too much invested in keeping you inside your old box. Society, however, is even harsher and less understanding. Society has its invisible hooks in all of us. You can become a pacifist in times of war. That's an individual choice. Yet it doesn't automatically extract you from the collective shadow, where war is born out of rage, prejudice, resentment, old grievances, and the dark underbelly of nationalism. Perhaps the discredited term of racial memory is viable, even though it makes us feel extremely uncomfortable. Yet millions of people aren't uncomfortable making statements like a typical male response or women drivers. Gender has turned into a hotly contested allegiance. The collective unconscious has you entangled at this moment. On the surface, Citizen X may be wildly opposed to Citizen Y, but at the unconscious level, they are conjoined, like the two ends of a tug of war. The choice to opt in or opt out becomes the central issue of the collective shadow. It gives rise to many questions in everyday life. What is my social obligation? What is my patriotic duty? How much should I conform to or resist society? How connected am I to other people? What do I owe to the less fortunate? Can I change the world? Asking any of these questions, your conscious mind cannot give the whole answer, or even the truest answer. Beneath the surface, the collective unconscious is roiling with drives, prejudices, frustrated desires, fears, and memories that are part of you, because we is your identity as much as I. Where's the proof? For a long time, the concept of the collective unconscious remained an intriguing theory without much proof. No one disputed that human nature has a dark side, but was Jung's explanation actually useful, or was it just a brilliant intellectual invention? Only recently have bits and pieces of proof been gathered, and if anything, they deepen the mystery. For example, it has been known for decades that when a person becomes lonely and isolated, as often happens to widows in old age, the risk of disease and death rises compared to that for people who have strong social connections. A happy marriage makes you healthy. At first, this finding was hard to accept because medical researchers saw no link between a mental state and the body. How could the heart or a precancerous cell somewhere in the body know how a person feels? It took the discovery of so-called messenger molecules to show that the brain translates every emotion into a chemical equivalent. As messenger molecules stream through the blood, circulating to hundreds of billions of cells, unhappiness or happiness gets transmitted to the heart, liver, intestines, and kidneys. Suddenly, mind-body medicine had a real basis, because nothing is more real than chemicals. But Jung was proposing that unhappiness or happiness could be shared by whole groups of people. Why does mass violence break out in Iraq or Rwanda? We can find explanations in long-standing tribal feuds and sectarian rifts. Are these stored in the collective unconscious, or do generations of parents tell their children to keep these ancestral grudges alive? It does no good to shake our heads and mutter about uncivilized, barbaric behavior. The greatest bloodbaths in history occurred during the two world wars. Millions of civilized soldiers marched into the jaws of death. Men who wrote poetry, played the piano, knew Greek and Latin. Afterward, Europe looked back and called this slaughter insane. But eminently sane people ran the war and died in it. And when conscientious objectors protested, they were jailed or punished by being sent to the front lines as medics. A tragic irony that killed many of the people who hated war the most and wanted to prevent it. The unconscious has a goal, which is to keep us unconscious. Sometimes knowledge peeks out anyway. In a famous social experiment at Stanford, psychologists replicated prison conditions to try to understand how guards treat prisoners. Undergraduates were divided into two groups, convicts and guards, and told to role play any way they wanted. The psychologists in charge expected to be able to see marked changes in the behavior of each group. And yet the experiment had to be cut off in a matter of days. The students playing the part of guards began to severely mistreat the prisoners to the point where humiliation and sexually charged abuse appeared. This stunning misfire gave rise to the theory of good apples and bad barrels. The old way of thinking had told psychologists that a bad apple can force a group to misbehave. Common sense says that a gang leader can induce his passive followers to commit crimes. College hazing goes too far because a small core of bad apples puts peer pressure on others. Yet the Stanford prison experiment told the opposite story. All the participants were good kids studying at a prestige university. Their misbehavior didn't occur because they were bad apples, but because they were in bad conditions that allowed dark forces to emerge. What the psychologists were seeing was nothing less than an incubator for the shadow, and the conditions that gave rise to group violence were cataloged. The shadow can emerge when there is complete anonymity, as often happens when, instead of being individuals, people become faces in a crowd. This loss of individuality increases if there are no consequences of one's bad actions. The absence of law and order amplifies the effect, as does being given permission to behave beyond normal morality. If authority figures are present to actively incite bad behavior and promise a lack of punishment, the shadow surfaces all the more easily. We don't have to make the barrel even worse by adding poverty, illiteracy, and old tribal ties, but they obviously taint conditions even more. So does any kind of us versus them thinking. When I say that the shadow can emerge, I mean any kind of mass pathology can appear. The Stanford prison experiment resurfaced to explain the abuses at Abu Ghraib prison during the Iraq War. But if we realized that ghettos are also examples of bad barrels in which there are good apples, we wouldn't resort to thinking of the underclass as morally inferior or worse. The destruction of the ecosystem is a form of violence against the planet. Yet it too involves good people doing very bad things because they have been given permission to, and they face no punishment. Except for the long-term harm that we all face, which can be ignored, denied, or put off until tomorrow. When people wake up from their misbehavior, they seem dazed and confused. The violence they perpetrated seems like a dream, even though they actively participated in horrors like war and genocide. The shadow traps us, therefore, in two ways. It keeps us unconscious and then erupts with incredible power whenever it wants to. You may say, what does this have to do with me? Most of us haven't participated in an outbreak of the shadow, like what occurred at Abu Ghraib. Instead of empathizing with the soldiers who abused their charges, we look for scapegoats to punish, because the bad apple explanation is easier to live with. Yet when you do something as innocent as drive your car, you're putting 19 pounds of carbon dioxide into the air, a greenhouse gas that is imperiling the planet. As a society, we could rectify this bad behavior in a few years, once we put our minds to it. The solutions, from cleaner cars to mass transportation to alternative fuels, already exist. Why don't we exploit them fully? Because remaining unconscious is easier. Skeptics have a right to point out that all of this still doesn't prove that there is a collective unconscious. Where is the evidence that members of a society are invisibly linked, without words or peer pressure binding them? A new field of sociology is studying social contagion, a deeply mysterious phenomenon that could change everything we think about our behavior. We all experience how fads and trends work. Out of the blue, everybody seems to be doing something new, whether it's texting, fleeing MySpace for Twitter, or playing a new video game. Fads are contagious behavior. You catch them from other people. Yet no one knows how behavior goes viral. What makes a group of people all decide to act the same way? This becomes a crucial medical question if you want a group to stop doing something harmful. If you want to persuade young people not to smoke, for example, or the general population to stop getting obese. The most advanced work on this question has come from two researchers at Harvard, Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler, whose new book, Connected, was previewed in a recent New York Times Sunday magazine article. Christakis and Fowler analyzed data from the nation's biggest heart study, which has followed 3 generations of citizens in Framingham, Massachusetts. They looked into the behavior of over 5,000 people who were mapped according to 51,000 social connections with family, friends, and coworkers. Their first discovery was that when one person gained weight, started smoking, or got sick, close family members and friends were around 50% more likely to behave the same way. This reinforces a social science principle that is decades old. Behavior runs in groups. We have all experienced it as peer pressure or by observing behavioral traits that seem to run in families. The reverse is also true. If you run with a healthy crowd, you are more likely to adopt healthy behavior yourself. Not just health is involved. Almost any behavior can be contagious. In a dorm at college, if you happen to room with someone with good study habits and high grades, your grades are likely to improve by association. But the second finding from Christakis and Fowler was far more mysterious. They found that social connections can skip a link. If person A is obese and knows person B, who isn't, A friend of person B is still 20% more likely to be obese. And a friend of that friend is 10% more likely. This 3 degrees of connection holds good for all kinds of behavior. A friend of a friend can make you prone to smoking, unhappiness, or loneliness. The statistics are there to prove it, even though you have never met this friend of a friend. The findings of Christakis and Fowler suggest invisible connectors that run through a whole society. If their research holds up, think about the implications. The notion of a collective unconscious was posed almost a century ago by Jung. Did Jung hit on invisible connectors long before data came along to support them? That's really a side question to the main one. What kind of connections can exist invisibly without people talking to each other, watching each other's behavior, or even knowing about each other's existence? These are complex issues, and I'm giving only a hint of how mysterious they are. But the new research on social contagion is exciting because it supports the notion that there is actually one mind that coordinates not just how people catch on to fads or decide to imitate each other, not just how distant brain cells know what other brain cells are doing, but far-flung phenomena like how twins, separated by thousands of miles, suddenly know what's happening to each other. These invisible connectors are bringing the collective unconscious into many, many areas of life. Social contagion is making news because we all like to rely on data. But the possibility that we all participate in one mind challenges religion, philosophy, and the meaning of life itself. The shadow, then, is a shared project. Anyone can have a hand in building it. All you need is the ability to remain unconscious. Countless fearmongers believe they are doing good. Every defender of the homeland expects to be honored and praised. Tribes warring against other tribes deeply believe that they must struggle in order to survive. We resist our shadow and deny its existence because of past indoctrination and the hypnosis of social conditioning. Childhood experiences cause unending later reminders that this is good, this is bad, this is divine, this is diabolical. Such indoctrination is the way all societies are structured. What we overlook is that we are creating a shared self at the same time. If children were taught to become aware of their shadow, sharing even dark feelings, forgiving themselves for not being good all the time, learning how to release shadow impulses through healthy outlets, then there would be much less damage to society and the ecosystem. That was from Deepak Chopra's portion of The Shadow Effect, illuminating the hidden power of your true self. I've been interested in shadow work for a long time, and as was mentioned in the text, this is from Jungian psychological theory. So essentially, the shadow, if this is the first time you're hearing of this concept, the shadow is those darker, less lovely parts of ourself that are, in no uncertain terms, part of ourself, but that we often try to press down and maybe even pretend it isn't there because we don't want to accept that that's part of us. And the concept in a tight nutshell is that pressing that down and pretending it isn't there actually makes it more powerful rather than making us less likely to act out from the darker side of our nature. I'm maybe only 30 pages into this, but it's quite an interesting read so far. And I would say that if you're at all interested in diving into this subject, so far I'm finding it to be a great read for laying down the context of what this even is and why it matters.